for this aspect of the apprehension of the object, that is, as it exists in the shape of consciousness, we have only to recall the earlier shapes of consciousness already encountered. Thus, in regard to the object so far as it is an immediacy, that is an indifferent being, we saw observing reason seeking and finding itself in this indifferent thing. That is, we saw it equally conscious of its action being external to it, as it was conscious of the object only as an immediate object. And we saw observing reason at its peak express its specific character in the infinite judgment that the being of the I is a thing, and moreover a sensuous, immediate thing. When the I is called soul, it is true that it is also represented as a thing, but as something invisible, intangible, etc., and therefore, in fact, not as an immediate being and not as what is meant by a thing. That judgment taken just as it stands is non-spiritual, or rather is the non-spiritual itself. In its notion, however, it is in fact the most richly spiritual, and this inner significance of what is not yet apparent is what is expressed in the two other moments to be considered. Paragraph 790 is continuing on with the looking back into Hegel's phenomenology and retracing, or at least to use the term here, recalling, erinnern, remembering the steps that have been taken so far. And you notice that at the end of this paragraph, we have this reference to two other moments to be considered, and this is going to happen in paragraph 791 and paragraph 792. And if we look ahead a little bit, in 793, these are going to be called the reconciliation of spirit with itself. And so Hegel is not just summarizing here. He is trying to say, look, what we did back then, what we observed, what we went along with as phenomenologists, this turns out to have been more than just what we were seeing at that time. This is leading us to the point of being able to grasp absolute knowing, or you might say rather to be absolute knowing, to participate in it together with each other. So he begins this paragraph by talking about this aspect of the apprehension of the object, the erfassen, gripping onto, grasping the object, the Gegenstand, the thing that stands over against us, which is going to turn out to be for us, and we're going to have a bit of ourselves in it. And so he goes on here, and he tells us, as it exists in the shape of consciousness. So, the entire phenomenology has been tracing out the history of the development of consciousness, which gets quite complicated and involves, consciousness of a particular moment reacting against its limitations or other consciousnesses or what has been on the scene already, and then moving ahead dialectically developing. And so the way that we're going to do this is through this process, as he says, of recalling, erinnern, the earlier shapes of consciousness, the Gestalten des Bewusstseins, already encountered. And, that's all of them in here, right? Because we're at the final stage of consciousness. We have traced out a number of different shapes. So what is the one that he's going to focus on this time? So notice in the previous paragraph, 789, right, we were talking about earlier shapes of consciousness, and we went through this knowing in terms of spiritual essentiality and a whole bunch of other shapes. And what did we get into? What did we remember? What did we bring up out of the depths? Well, it was primarily stuff from the consciousness section. Now we're going into reason, the big reason section, and specifically observing reason, beobachtendes rather, Vernunft. And, we saw that a lot of that had to do with this kind of scientific attitude towards the world, and we saw Hegel talking about all sorts of interesting science of his time. And then we get to probably the most interesting portion of that section, where it's no longer just the object out in the world that we're observing, whether it's in terms of like acids and bases and properties and all that kind of stuff, forces, laws, or in terms of observing animals and their various, functions like reproduction, irritability, and all that. Now we're actually going back to and recalling the observation of the human being as an object of study. And what does that mean? Well, that means the phrenology and physiognomy section, where we're looking at people and saying, aha, we understand what's going on because we understand the way your skull or your other arrangements of matter have been arranged, have come to be developing out of what you are, right? And we can look in the mirror and do that as well. Oh, I got a nice skull there. I must be one of those brainy types. Or, oh, look at that. That's not so good. So we go on and he says, in regard to the object, insofar as it is an immediacy, right? Unmittelbarkeit, it is an indifferent being. Now, this is kind of an interesting phrasing here. Ein gleichgültiges Sein. So being a being, Sein, right? A thing. Gleichgültiges could be indifferent, but it could also be that it's indifferent because whatever we take it up as, it's just as good. That's another way of translating in a figurative sense, gleichgültiges, right? It has some value, but it's the same value no matter what. And what is it that's checking this out? Observing reason, seeking, suchen, and finding, finden, itself in this indifferent thing. So it's not just that observing reason is looking at, studying, investigating this object as immediacy, this indifferent being, whatever it happens to be. It's finding itself in there. And it's not just coincidentally finding itself in there. It is seeking itself. Seeking what of itself? Well, perhaps the desire to know, the desire to understand. And here he brings up two additional aspects of this. So we've got this movement towards the object, and then we also have, he says, consciousness of the object only as immediate object. So this is the way consciousness is actually grasping it, but it's also conscious of its action being external to it. Now, its action, its comportment, being external to it, being external to the object, being external to its own self. The indifference, we could say, creeps in to the action. And what action are we talking about here? The action that's required to make sense of this thing that's confronting it, the object in front of it. Now, here's where we get to the real interesting meat. We saw observing reason at its peak, at its Spitze, right, at the height, express its specific character, right, or specified character, bestimmt, and here he's talking about an infinite judgment, unendliches Urteil, right? The infinite judgment that what? That the being of the I is a thing. Now, the being of the I, that is observing reason, observing about itself. It is the I. It's not looking at, toads and rock formations and finding an I there. You find the I as the observer looking at your own thought processes. And, here we have the reduction of the I to, as he says, a sensuous, immediate thing. And, what are we talking about here? Spirit is a bone, as we said so long ago. So he goes on and he says something interesting here now. When the I is a soul, then we go beyond. We transgress the boundaries of, we transcend, seemingly, although perhaps transgress is a better term. The thing can no longer, as he says, be something sensuous and immediate. It is now something invisible. You can't actually see the soul. Intangible, etc. So, all the other sort of aspects. So he says, therefore, in fact, not as an immediate being and not what is meant as things. So we've got two different sides to the human subject that takes in the objects in the form of observing reason. It is, on the one hand, a sensuous thing. It can look at itself in the mirror and say, aha, that's me right there. Or it can look down at itself or, watch a video of itself, whatever that may happen to be. And on the other hand, it is also soul, but it's not soul by being soul as separate from the body. It's the aspect of the body that is not simply reducible to object as immediacy, not just a sensuous, immediate thing, but is the I. Now, both of these have to be kept in view. So he says that judgment, and so the judgment has two sides, right? The judgment, taken just as it stands, is non-spiritual, or is the non-spiritual itself. Now, non-spiritual, non-geistige, right? Not being of spirit. So reason in this case can kind of lose its way. And on the other hand, insofar as we're trying to think, of something more than just the immediate thing, he says, in its notion, it is in fact the most richly spiritual. So, which is it? Well, it's both at the same time. And he says this inner significance of what is not yet apparent, here we get to where we began, is what is expressed in the other two moments to be considered. And it will be expressed by working through these other two moments. The thing is I. In point of fact, in this infinite judgment, the thing is superseded. In itself, it is nothing. It has meaning only in the relation, only through the I and its connection with it. This moment manifested itself for consciousness in pure insight and enlightenment. Things are simply useful and to be considered only from the standpoint of utility. The cultivated self-consciousness, which has traversed the world of self-alienated spirit, has, through its self-alienation, produced the thing as its own self. Therefore, it still retains its own self in it and knows that the thing lacks self-subsistence, that it is essentially only a being for an other, or to give complete expression to the relationship, that is, to what alone constitutes the nature of the object here, the thing counts for it as something that exists on its own account. It declares sense certainty to be absolute truth. But this being for itself is itself declared to be a moment that merely vanishes and passes over into its opposite, into a being that is at the disposal of an other. Paragraph 791, as we're carrying out this task of looking at or remembering previous shapes of consciousness drawn from the phenomenology, we see that there's a lot of telescoping and jumping over vast sections that is taking place here, because what is this section referring to? Earlier we saw consciousness and reason coming up. Now we're like right in the heart of spirit, actually getting closer in some respects to the end, certainly beyond the midpoint of it. And interestingly, if you look at the previous paragraph, right, where this infinite judgment, unendliches Urteil was brought up, now we actually have a reversal of the terms. And it's kind of funny that, Hegel seems to think nobody's actually going to notice this, somebody who pays so much attention in other places to the logical form of propositions. So he tells us the thing is I. What we had before was the I, or the being of the I, is a thing. Now we have the thing is I. And he's going to say that this is going to be, well, at least the thing itself is going to be superseded, aufgehoben. A very important term that we've seen many, many times in the phenomenology. It's the way the dialectic proceeds. So the thing is I, in point of fact, in this infinite judgment, the thing is superseded. So the judgment isn't superseded. The proposition isn't superseded. One term of it, in this case, the subject, is being superseded. How so? He says, well, in itself, an sich, it's nothing. It is a nothing. There's nothing there, right? And we could jump ahead to the end of this passage where he's going to re-invoke sense certainty. The thing counts for it, for something else, as something that exists on its own account. It declares sense certainty to be absolute truth. It sounds like we're back at the beginning, but notice what he says there. But this being for self is declared to be a moment that merely vanishes and passes over into its opposite, into a being that is at the disposal of another. So if the thing isn't nothing, it's got a nothingness within it. It only has value, we could say, in relation to something that is not merely a thing, the I in this case. And so Hegel will talk here about, he'll use several different interesting terms, right? Meaning, the meaning, the Bedeutung of the nothing that is the thing, the relation, Verhältnisse, im Verhältnisse, in a relation to the I. And what does he got to say there? It has meaning only in this relation, only through, durch, the I, and its connection, Beziehung, with it. Whose connection? Well, we could interpret this two ways. The thing has a connection and a relation and a meaning for the I. And the I also has connection to itself, meaning within itself, through the thing. Right? So what is this going to lead us to? He tells us this moment manifested itself for consciousness. Now, manifested is kind of an ambitious term here. Hat sich ergeben. Right? It offered itself. It gave itself. Manifested is fine. For consciousness, für Bewusstsein, now here we get to some shapes of consciousness from the spirit section, right? In pure insight. And remember, what was insight being raised in relation to? There were a couple interesting dialectics with dualities in the spirit section. First we had, the whole thing about law and two different kinds, the law of the city, law of the gods, the law of the family. Then we moved on to, cool dynamics like wealth and state power and how those work out, the noble and base consciousness. And then finally we get to faith, and then what conquers faith, or at least to some degree, insight, Ansicht, right? So reinen Einsicht is pure insight, and then we get to the Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, right? Hegel thinks that the Enlightenment is massively important historically, but also for the development of consciousness as spirit. So that's what's going on here. And there's lots of things going on in the Enlightenment, but the aspect that Hegel is going to pick out here has to do with usefulness. He says, things are simply useful, right? And are nützlich, and are to be considered only from the standpoint of utility, of their usefulness for us. So, I mean, what does this mean? Well, things don't have value in and of themselves. They have value in their relationship to living human subjects who can say I, who can make use of the thing. Usefulness right there, right? Who can take advantage of the thing, who can give a meaning, give an assessment to the thing. The thing can't give an assessment to itself. And we are in a thoroughly humanized world here at this point. And he talks about world, right? So he talks about the cultivated, gebildete self-consciousness that has traversed, and again we see this word durch involved there, durchlaufen, right? To travel through the world, the Welt of self-alienated, selbstentfremdetes, becoming alien to itself, becoming foreign to itself, other to itself, spirit. And it becomes, through this process of traversing this world of self-alienated spirit, which is a world of other human beings, a world of human meanings, a world of things that have their usefulness for other human beings. We could think about this, although Hegel doesn't talk here at this point, as something intergenerational, as something intersubjective, right? You become an alienated self-consciousness by leaving a world of things that seem to have value in themselves behind and entering into a world of spirit where everything has a price. And its price is what somebody is willing to pay for it based upon its usefulness in relation to them, in relation to their desires, in relation to what it is that they intend to do. You can swap things in relation to each other. Things become replaceable, become reducible to others. So this is all involved in the self-alienation here. And he tells us this cultivated self-consciousness has, through its self-alienation, now there's several different things he says, has produced, erzeugt, right, brought about, the thing as its own self. And he says that there is a knowledge, a knowing, Weiß, there. It knows. What does it know? Something about the thing. And the other thing that, or the other moment that we have to talk about that here is it retains its own self in it. So in grasping the thing as something that has been imbued with meaning, with value, through relationship, through connection to the subject, suddenly the subject has placed itself in the thing. That's one reason why the thing has the usefulness or value that it does. That's one reason why we can talk about it as not just having usefulness or value for this self-consciousness, but for other self-consciousnesses as well. If something merely has value only for you, in a certain way, it's not a thing. It's not a part of a economy. It's not part of a society of self-alienated spirits, self-consciousnesses. All right, so we can go on from here. He says that it knows the thing what? The thing is useful, but the thing also lacks self-subsistence. It lacks a independence of itself. Why? Because, as he says, it is essentially only a being for another. So the thing, insofar as it is considered in itself, is really nothing. It's only insofar as it is for another that it has any sort of genuine being. And we should remember, too, that usefulness is about as low as you can go in the scale of value and being, right? It doesn't have self-subsistence in what matters. It does have self-subsistence in, existing or in lasting. So, for example, a piece of chalk, this cylindrical thing right here, if I put it away and, leave it in my desk drawer, somebody can come back long after I'm dead and be like, oh, I mean, assuming they're still using chalk in the distant future, that's a piece of chalk. Or they could be like, what is this object? Oh, this was a thing that people back in the day used to use to write on these boards of slate that we called chalkaboards. And they can't pronounce things properly from our vantage point in the future, right? And it has meaning only insofar as it is a humanized artifact. It can have existence. It can have mere being, all you want. Nobody cares. It only matters insofar as it is something for other human beings. And like I mentioned, maybe we stop using chalk. And this, because it doesn't have self-subsistence and only exists in relation to those of us who actually understand its usage, its usefulness suddenly no longer has the meaning that it previously enjoyed. It's taken away, right? So he says, and here we come to the end of this passage, or to give a complete expression to the relationship to what alone constitutes the nature of the object. Here, the thing counts for it as something that exists on its own account. It declares sense certainty to be absolute truth. The thing, insofar as it can actually metaphorically declare anything, is telling us what you see is what you get. This is the reality. But we see already that that is nothing. And it breaks down in its meaning, in its reference, in its relation to what it is for another, for us as self-consciousnesses. And so, this is what Hegel takes to be an important essential moment in the development of spirit, in a world of self-alienated spirit in which we self-consciousnesses are also self-alienated, which means that we ourselves, although he's not saying it here, are things that exist in relation to others as well.